Hi everyone, welcome to week 13. Today we're going to be going over chapter 11 and Edson chapter 27. And like I mentioned last week, we're kind of getting into a space where so many of us who are currently taking this class had been alive through at least a majority, if not all, of the timeline that we're going to be talking about in these next final chapters of our class. And so kind of going away from world events just because I feel like so many of us acknowledge or were around, had recently been told stories about what things were going on during these last couple of decades. And so really kind of focusing on more so how those specific instances impact sport. And so this week we're going to be going over 15 years of sport between 2000 and 2015, in which we're going to see a lot of international expansion of sport. We're really seeing the recognizability of sports into what it really is today and how those foundations just recently were established into those, again, modern precursors to a very recognizable sport nowadays. And so, like I said, there's going to be a lot of stuff talking about international sport, both on the Olympic side, but also the expansion of American sports internationally, as well as international athletes coming to the United States to play American sports. We're going to talk a lot about the Olympics and really the growth of different ways in which sport has had power internationally. But really what I want to focus on too is acknowledging that at the turn of the 21st century, we really started to reestablish sports as a national pastime, and in particular, a nationalistic pastime, in which the 9/11 terrorist attacks, granted in 2001, really reaffirmed sport as a nationalistic pastime, really reaffirming the idea that sports can emulate patriotism, and those were really helpful in times of sheer crisis, that Americans were scared and mourning for people that had been directly and indirectly impacted by the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And so they were really looking for something to unify the country. And what that unification was in the medium of sport. That President George Bush walked onto the field during the Game 3 of the 2001 World Series game on October 30th in 2001 really proved to be symbolic of national change. That not only was this a very vivid example of using sports as a way to kind of bridge the uncertainty, bridge different ideologies, bridge different backgrounds, and really be unified again as a nation with sport being the medium to do so. And so people began to rally with patriotism in the sporting space, in which sport organizers really reinforce this perception of sport as a very patriotic, nationalistic, and heroic pastime, particularly with the NFL. And even today, as we're going to talk about different ways in which this patriotism is very vivid and explicit in the sporting space, it's really hard now to separate these feelings of nationalism with sport, with the things that we see every day in sport, military appreciation nights, the national anthem, and militaristic diction in sport. And so it proved to be an extremely powerful medium that even today has kind of shaped itself into, again, sport isn't just sport in the United States. It's a reflection of our national values. And we see that very vividly as a result of using sport as a way to reaffirm nationalism after 9/11. And so we see that growth in a lot of different ways. We're going to talk about the business of professional sport and kind of acknowledging that, again, sport really reaffirmed itself as our national pastime. And there's different ways in which different leagues really reaffirmed that popularity. So for baseball, the MLB, baseball experienced a lot of growing pains during the 21st century. They really aimed to restructure their strategy and outreach to spectators through a lot of different mediums. And so last week we talked about how stadiums were kind of used as pseudo museums or kind of these other avenues for people who aren't necessarily sports fans but want to be a part of like our culture, our history. Stadiums can be a way to kind of bridge that differing of interests. And so for baseball, they recognize that, again, new stadiums and renovations to stadiums can be really helpful. They know that it's known to be attractive to tourists, and they also moved a lot of teams around during this era to more successful, more economically profitable cities. We saw the Montreal Expos become the Washington Nationals, and unfortunately, as we saw with our conversation around the displacement that stadiums have, we see this quite often, and unfortunately, maybe purposefully, maybe not, but really kind of focusing on displacing communities without rightful reparation or rent control in those spaces where these new stadiums have been erected. We also have a much greater international presence and expansion. A lot of professional baseball players at the time were international stars. International stars at the time made up 28% of the the Major League Baseball League, as well as international fandom exploded. 800% increase of international revenue for professional baseball. It also guaranteed talent, despite these huge contracts, like Ichiro Suzuki from Japan ended up getting close to $200 million in his career and actually just got inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And so again, reaffirmed this greater acceptance of international athletes having and accepting of that dominance in that American sport. The MLB also began selling products, broadcasting rights, and holding exhibition games like the World Baseball Classic that started in 2006 that we now continue to see throughout modern sports. We also have the growth of sports analytics. So I kind of like this picture to be used here because Moneyball, if any of us have ever seen Moneyball, is a telling of a true story that happened within professional baseball at this time. That the league started to focus on hiring young general managers with experience and expertise in sport analytics, like what we saw in Moneyball. They really wanted to maximize profits and started to allow much smaller teams to establish themselves against legends like Kansas City Royals defeating the New York Yankees during this era. Basically, what they did is they assessed performance metrics of no-name athletes in the minors, of high school, of college, basically ignoring the fact that nobody knew their name, none of these athletes had big contracts, but they were getting on base. They were getting RBIs. They were getting home runs. They were getting OPS like statistics, and so it was a way for them to save money because nobody knew who these athletes were, so they didn't have to pay them large contracts while still guaranteeing them performance. And so this was really transformational because not only did it impact smaller league teams like the movie Moneyball really focused on the Oakland Athletics, but all major professional organizations really took inspiration from this tactic. The NFL, the NBA also started to shift into focusing on sport analytics and really marked this new interest in sports science, which is really where we start to see ourselves today. We also see the expansion of professional football, and the value for football teams really skyrocketed as national popularity grew. So again, a lot of this does have more patriotic ties, like this idea that nationalism and militarism really does tie in well with football. But we also started to see a lot more strategic expansion for the sport of professional football, very similarly to the MLB. There are also a lot of new stadiums and renovation, multi-million, even billion-dollar projects where local taxpayers often absorbed the cost and displaced entire communities without those rightful reparations or rent limits, like we saw with SoFi Stadium in Inglewood. Granted, this was a little bit after the era that we're talking about today, but nonetheless important and impactful to consider when you have these new stadiums and renovations happening. We also saw international expansion as well, but it wasn't as successful as what we found for professional baseball. There was little success in Europe because of the direct competition with rugby and soccer. However, there was a lot of gravitation and acceptance of football in other countries, particularly with East Asia. So much so that there's a Chinese American Football League where 71 countries play the sport. We also have a lot of international merchandising broadcasting that reaches fans from Mexico all the way to Russia. And so there are pockets of niche fandoms across the world, but nothing really like we see in the United States. And so because of that, a lot of athletes acknowledge that, again, it's growing on domestic soil. So they wanted to have more money, more agency. So in 2011, there were issues with athlete pay. The National Football League faced another lockout, but resolved it very quickly with the following changes. Veterans started to receive bigger contract, while unfortunately rookies lost out on bigger contracts. Players want a reduction in the number and duration of games, but owners want an income increase as kind of a compensation for not going into the season very long. But it was interesting because in 2011, the owners wanted to expand the season, right? Because if you have a longer season, you are able to get more money from spectators, from broadcasting rights. And so in 2011, owners wanted to extend the NFL season to 18 regular season games, which now looking back at that is really close to what we have at 17 regular season games, one bye week in between. But all this to say that when this happened, again, very similarly to what we experienced with professional baseball last decade or the last few decades, was that fans really didn't pity the plights of these athletes and owners, these multi-million-dollar athletes. They didn't really care for their plights. And so just to kind of showcase as well, an athlete that really took this era of football by storm is Tom Brady, who now is still in the football space, but as a talking head, as a play-by-play announcer, and not so much as an athlete. But he very much was symbolic of this era of football as being wildly profitable, wildly popular, and we see this really grow into what it is today. We also have the expansion of professional basketball, and really the sport's rising popularity kind of shifted away from athletes like Magic, Michael Jordan, and really became popular through new star LeBron James, who is still playing for professional basketball. And so just to kind of give you a bit of background on LeBron James' legacy, he was a teenage prodigy. He bypassed college ball, which is now no longer allowed. You have to at least spend 1 year outside of high school, either in the G Leagues, international leagues, or playing for college, and then you're able to be drafted in the NBA. He won Rookie of the Year, got I believe probably 3 Olympic golds at this point, as well as 5 championship rings, and really kind of allowed basketball to grow into this idea that, again, it really focuses on individual accolades. The idea that, again, to differentiate the culture between basketball, baseball, football, basketball very much liked the idea of applauding individual athletes. They love the individualism, the stardom, and so we see that in this era with LeBron James. We also see a lot of international expansion as well. The NBA turned to the international market to offset the cost of the 1998 labor strike we talked about last week. And so we saw an expansion in broadcasting, merchandising, and star athletes where Yao Ming really kind of came about in the 90s, but did only start to play in the NBA in the early 2000s. They also had yearly exhibition games in various nations, and basketball really challenged this notion of soccer being the most popular sport internationally. There are a lot of nations in which the most popular sport is basketball and not soccer, and so we really have to thank this growth, this push of the NBA during this era to really allow for that international expansion to be felt. But just like we saw with our professional football issues, we also started to have a lot of labor relations issues with professional basketball, in which at the time, a new CBA that was established in 2016 ran through the 23-24 season, really established a lot of new things happening in the sport of basketball. Both owners and players demanded more money for less game time, and so they were able to at least concede to the fact that they didn't want to have a longer season, but they also wanted to reap the rewards of having professional basketball start to expand both domestically and internationally. And so with that, some opted to play for European or Chinese leagues during this time. But the collective CBA, or the collective bargaining agreement in 2016, established the following rights: increased healthcare for athletes, increased benefits, the creation of two-way contracts, which is pretty novel, in which athletes themselves had a lot of agency to determine who they played for and where, how much money they were able to get, and so that increased the amount of agency athletes had in a time that owners really wanted to maintain that power. We also started to see designated veteran player exemptions, shorter preseason, and no more than 6 exhibition games. So really trying to keep athletes on American soil, even though there was so much international fandom. We also start to see the expansion of the National Hockey League, which again, just like every other league, there was greater international market expansion, which can contrast to baseball, football, and basketball. Hockey was an international sport before it came and established itself in the United States. That there is a lot of international talent, so much so that American-born hockey players actually make up a minority of the folks who actually play in the National Hockey League. And so we see this international market expansion, a lot of success in Japan and Eastern Europe after the Iron Curtain fell. So after the end of the USSR, after the Cold War resolved itself, we start to have a lot more international communications and cultural exchange with folks who had no real impact or access to American sports and American culture. We start to see that a lot more after the Iron Curtain fell, particularly with these communist nations. And so with that, we start to see the expansion in stars like Alex Ovechkin, who was from Russia, And he actually just recently beat Wayne Gretzky's goal record. And that's just a testament to the longevity of him in his career, but also acknowledging that, again, this is an international sport by the athletes that play it and the athletes and people who watch it. So with that, we did see a large domestic market expansion in which America has 25 of the 32 teams that make up the NHL. They had the addition of the Las Vegas Golden Knights as well as the Seattle Kraken in recent years, in which Canada only has 7 of those 32 teams. But again, comparing that to professional baseball, where Canada only has 1 professional team, basketball, where Canada only has 1 professional team, football, where all of the teams are in the United States. This is a very large portion of a professional sports team that is in another nation besides the United States. And so it is, again, an international sport. Overall, we still have most of our teams being played in the United States. But just like we saw in other leagues, there were a lot of labor disputes for professional hockey as well. Athletes and owners fought so much that they even forfeited an entire hockey season over it. They couldn't really settle an agreement. So between 2004, 2005, there was no professional hockey league by the NHL is what we know it today. Many rules were changed throughout this period to make the game more exciting, entice spectatorship, and eventually the CBA was reached that really appealed to both athletes and the owners of professional hockey. We also see the growth of other professional sports like boxing, tennis, golf, and soccer with auto racing, in which boxing really kind of reemerged itself after becoming a niche sport in the 60s, 70s. Boxing, as well as other types of MMA sports, became very popular during this era, really kind of on the back of very prolific athletes like Floyd Mayweather, in which the wealthiest athlete of all time is Floyd Mayweather. Not only was he an extremely talented athlete with a 50-0 record, he also has over $1 billion accumulated in his career. But most of that money didn't come from his athletic experiences, but actually as a promoter for Mayweather Promotions. And so he was able to establish himself not only as a promoter, but as an athlete for that notoriety and money. There are a lot of other athletes in the sport of boxing as well, like Manny Pacquiao, who was a Filipino boxer who not only was extremely dominant in the sport, but he took that clout and actually ran for Senate in the Philippines and actually ran for president. He unfortunately lost, but through his notoriety and dominance in the sport, he currently is the VP of International Boxing Association, so the IBA, which is really cool. We also have Conor McGregor from Ireland. He didn't box, but he was an MMA fighter. Very chippy, very fun to watch. And so kind of gaining a lot of popularity through that attitude. We saw very much fighting sports gain popularity during this era. We also have tennis, in which the Williams sisters took the sport by storm, really bringing tennis to a space of anybody can do it. Not to say that they're not talented in their own right, but as we've seen in this class, tennis is a very white elitist sport. And so having the Williams sisters, again, Black girls from Compton, California, really shake out the elitism and gatekeeping strategies of tennis through all these generations, really allowed the sport to be acceptable and really have a lot of mainstream access for folks who have historically not had access to these types of sports. We also see this with golf. Tiger Woods really shook the foundation of elitism, of whiteness around the sport of golf. Even though it wasn't an American sport, we still kind of have this air of elitism with country clubs, dues, membership rights. And so Tiger Woods, being a multi-ethnic athlete, really, again, challenged these ideas of white supremacy within the sport of golf. He was extremely dominant, kind of a child prodigy of the sport. Still in the golfing space, has tried to get back into the pro circuit, but again, reflecting on his legacy very much stems from this era of sport. And then we have soccer and auto racing start to develop more so in the United States, and really on the back of the initiatives of Rupert Murdoch. So Rupert Murdoch isn't an athlete, but he is a multi-millionaire, if not arguably billionaire, but very influential in the sport broadcasting arena. And so Rupert Murdoch secured the rights to broadcast NASCAR as well as men's and women's World Cups through his Fox network conglomerate. So we still have a lot of power and influence of media brands over professional sports. So, in addition to professional sports starting to grow and develop, we also start to see the growth of international sport, particularly with the Division One of football subdivision system. And really, this is the big focus of this conversation because that's where a lot of the money is. And so, when you consider the commercialization efforts of college football, it's not new, right? We've seen this for over a century at this point, but we now start to see it become so much more recognizable to what it is today because of these changes that happened during the 21st century. And a lot of that is really surrounding playoffs, company sponsorships, as well as acknowledging increased university scandals. And so in terms of the playoff system, this was an era that was marked by establishing a committee as well as bowl game rotations. And so to kind of give us a bit more context to what that means. So FBS means football subdivision. And in the Division 1 era or area of NC2A sports, this is kind of what you can think of as like the best of the best, cream of the crop, the most commercialized. There's a lot of money to be had. Additionally, within Division 1 NC2A sports, we have a lot of subdivisions. So a lot of these NC2A D1 schools have football programs, and in particular football bowl subdivision programs, in which these are the football programs that are the best of the best football programs that they're able to qualify for bowl games, in which they're able to commercialize the heck out of these teams and out of these spectacles. And so, because it was so profitable, Division I university presidents and the NC2A fought over a streamlined system for a national playoff system, right? Because the idea that, again, this was kind of the Wild West of commercialization. There was a lot of money to be had, but there wasn't a way to present it to make it very tangible for fans, make it very streamlined for people to put money towards the sport. It was kind of just based on popularity, where the money was at any given point. And so in 2013, there was an agreement made that national championships would be determined by a 13-member committee of experts that selected the top 25 teams each week. And all these rankings would change after, Friday, Saturday football, leading up to the top 4 at the time to play in playoffs. Now that has now shifted to, I believe, allowing 16 teams, the top 16 teams, to be able to compete for buy-ins if they win their conference, as well as just having good records overall in order to play for the top spot to win the NC2A championship for football, right? And so bowl games would be hosted to have semifinal games on a rotating basis, and the host cities for the national championship would be decided by a bid, just like how we would have a lot of bids fought over for the Olympics, because again, people wanted to make money off of these spectacles. People were going to watch college football. That was just something that was very common and very expected. And so we started to see this happen. And again, that has now shifted to where now it's not just the top 4 to compete for a spot for the FB or for the CFP, but now we have 16 teams fighting for that based on if they win their conference championship, if they have a good record, and so all these things to say that's how it's established. Now, that being said, a lot of companies recognize that there is a lot of money to be had, and so we start to see a lot of company sponsorships of not only companies sponsoring games like bowl games, like the Peach Bowl sponsored by Chick-fil-A, as well as sponsoring championship games, like you would have the T-Mobile Bowl or the Fiesta Bowl from, Pace Salsa or things like that. We also see companies sponsoring and endorsing individual schools. And so school brands and broadcasting companies also took to endorsing individual schools, again, depending on the fandom, depending on the local culture. Louisville and ESPN have exclusive deals. Nike and the University of Oregon have exclusive deals. And so it led to, unfortunately, a lot of reshuffling as a result of some universities just having so much more money than other universities. And because they had more money, they were able to pay for better coaches. They were able to have better training facilities, recovery facilities. They were able to have the state-of-the-art equipment for their talents. And so it really allowed for these richer schools to be better than smaller market, poorer schools. And so that wasn't fair, right? And so what happened as a result of this is that initially, before this reconfiguration, schools played geographically close schools, regardless of how much money was at these institutions. But like I said, it didn't necessarily equate to fairness because some schools got more money than other schools, even if they were very geographically close together. And so between 2009 and 2013, dozens of schools reconfigured themselves into conferences that better aligned with similar fandoms, similar money, similar notoriety, and more revenue. And so this is where we have the creation of, again, at the time, the Pac-12 was, again, Pacific schools, but not just schools that were on the Pacific Coast, but schools that were on the Pacific Coast that had more money, more notoriety. Compare that to, let's say, the Big West, that were still on the West Coast, but didn't have as much money, notoriety, and frankly, it wouldn't have been equal competition between the Pac-12 and the Big West. So even though they were geographically close, they wanted to differentiate themselves based on competition, money, and other branding deals compared to smaller market schools and universities through the Big West, just to give you some examples. And so these schools better align themselves with very commercialized efforts, but that unfortunately led to a lot of university scandals, that many universities did everything in their powers to maintain the commercialized efforts that were set in place by these changes that happened for collegiate football. They give student athletes a lot of leeway in their classes, that if they can perform better athletically, they were able to have an increased degree completion window, basically years of eligibility, that for typical non-athletic students, you are expected to at least get your degree done within 4 to 5 years. Now, for student athletes, they have a window of 6 years, right? That they have 6 years of eligibility as student athletes. That also means they have 6 years to complete their degree. We also see that there is a rampant cheating system for athletes in which University of Miami actually started to allow gifting of money to their athletes. University of North Carolina created fake classes for their athletes to maintain GPA eligibility. And unfortunately, as a result of this, a lot of athletes started to be very critical of this system. Yes, it was easier for them, but when they would leave these athletic institutions or academic institutions, they wouldn't have anything to fall back on besides their athletic experiences. Their degree didn't hold a lot of merit. They didn't have the best GPA compared to their non-athlete peers. And so as kind of recompense to that, a lot of athletes wanted to start to make money. That if this is all I could really garner in this time here at college, I want to be able to make money off of my name, image, and likeness. And so athletes at the time felt very exploited by their school systems. And so they wanted to be compensated for that with NIL. And so we're going to talk more so about NIL next week, just because at the time, this was really a small kind of conversations, kind of scuttlebutt around NIL. Comparatively to what it is today, this pales in comparison to the system of NIL. And so again, we're going to talk more about that next week. And so getting into our conversation of gender and acknowledging that, again, this is a really great point in our history in which we do see a lot more acceptance, celebration of women athletes. There's still a lot of sexist narratives surrounding Title IX, particularly in college. And again, we talked about Title IX as kind of being the legal precursor to allow for greater equity in sports and education. But Title IX is also to blame for a lot of plights and shortcomings that we see in sports. And so Edson chapter 27 really kind of wants to debunk these narratives, sexist narratives surrounding Title IX, and in focusing in ways that really don't demonize women's sports, but really kind of shift the focus towards football as the reason for a lot of these shortcomings in sports. And so some of the sexist narratives that we do see, or kind of the discourse that we find ourselves in, and particularly with college, is this idea of women's sports don't pay for itself. And this is very ignorant to the fact that most extracurriculars don't pay for themselves. Very rarely, only with like highest level NC2A FBS universities for football and basketball, do we see those programs actually turn a profit? The idea of extracurriculars paying for itself is a very capitalistic mindset that is very rare in other situations. We also kind of had the discourse of Title IX cuts men's teams and scholarships, but that's actually due to football, because when we reflect on Title IX, that there have to be an equal opportunity and equal offerings of scholarships for men and women. For men, most of those scholarships first go to football programs, which can have upwards of 60, 70 athletes on a roster. Then those scholarships have to be offered to women before they can offer those scholarships to other men's programs. And so this would be a different conversation if there was a women's football program, but there's not. And so women are to blame for this because they're often thought of as oh, women get the scholarships over smaller men's teams, but really it's due to football taking those scholarships away from smaller men's teams. What about the idea that football pays for all other sports? And this could be true in some situations, but it's really not due to the sport itself, but due to the fact that this is a highly commercialized sport due to the broadcasting contracts, inflated rosters, as well as inflated salaries of football programs that really ought to be reduced to allow for a trickle-down effect to other smaller market teams and other smaller market sports. And then the idea that big time college sports is an economic model, the idea that it's capitalistic and effective life in the 21st century, the idea that the mecca of football isn't going to go away, so we just got to get used to it. And it's like, okay, I hear you, right? The idea that it does have a cultural force. But if college football was really reflective of a capitalistic economic model, then the idea of a winner versus loser market isn't actually true, because we would see a lot more closures of these historically terrible football programs that would have terrible losing streaks close. Because again, if all things are fair and equal, that it really should only be rewarding the best of the best, that schools that have historically been terrible wouldn't still be around today. And so college football is both the issue and the solution to many issues surrounding college sports, particularly smaller men's programs. But people would rather shut down smaller men's programs than try to fight against the Goliath of college football. And we talked about some of the reasons why. There's just so much money to be had, and people really wanted to kind of be money grubby. And this idea of commercialization was very much a motivating factor in promoting college football in many different spaces at the turn of the 21st century. Title IX really has, in its altruistic sense, the positive lens, really has provided a new generation of women to experience and expect equal sporting rights as men, but there's still a lot of work to be done, especially in professional leagues. And so there's often these very strong issues that impact women in sport, in particular these dual focuses of women in media, in which we find that, again, in the early 2000s, women were often thought of or written as either too focused or too distracted. The idea that women in sport are either too involved in their sports to fulfill other gendered expectations. So, right, these historical expectation of women being mothers, of women being caretakers, that if women are professional athletes, they're not doing these things that are expected of them. But then on the flip side of that kind of hypocrisy, if women are indulging in other pursuits of being mothers, of being business owners, then they're not giving their all to their sports and their careers. And so the Williams sisters are a phenomenal example of this, that they brought great attention and admiration to the sport of tennis through their dominance. But both sisters have established ownership in other sports teams and have other businesses besides their athletic careers. And so despite their successes, a lot of the media really focuses on either their physicality within the sport, the idea that either they're adhering to expectations or not, or they're explicitly focusing on these businesses as a lack of focus within their tennis careers. We also see that women representation in sports media, particularly at the turn of the 21st century, is either focusing on women as being objectifying sexy bodies or as mothers, and not at all as strong professional athletes. That a lot of media portrayals of women athletes either focus on their appearance or on their domestic roles outside of sports, which is, again, very detrimental because women are only valued either as sex objects or that they're of their mother, or their value as motherhood, their value as creating another life for other pursuits. And so it's both objectifying and sexist because male athletes are often featured and celebrated by their money as well as their athletic accomplishments. And it's really interesting too to acknowledge that this is now shifting. I think that we are now seeing a much greater appreciation for women as athletes, but not without its pitfalls, right? There's still various examples in which we have a countercurrent of acceptance with sexism, rampant sexism in various spaces, and so we see this in many different ways. Because of that, many organizations don't care about this sexualization because oftentimes rules of women's sports require or expect this inherent sexualization, specifically with gendered clothing. Beach volleyball is one of those sports that's kind of on the battleground for this equity in sport, in which beach volleyball initially was a sport that was you had to play in certain very revealing clothes in a bikini. But it was given leeway at the Olympics after a lot of pushback. For boxing, International Boxing Committee started to require skirts for its female women boxers. But that immediately changed because the women were threatening a lockout. And they recognized that, again, in this space, women's sports can be offered as a novelty, particularly in the fighting space. We also see that for other sports that aren't necessarily advertently sexualized, that sexualization just happens to a lot of athletes. In particular, Brandi Chastain, who is a captain for the U.S. women's national soccer team, there's a very famous picture of her ripping off her jersey after they won the 1999 World Cup. So she, it was a famous picture because she ripped off her sports bra in celebration. She was screaming. She was so happy that they were able to take home another gold. And unfortunately, most media news outlets didn't write on the fact that they won another gold medal, but they wrote on the fact that she was in a sports bra. That people really looked at this as tainting the image of women's sports, that she was just showing off her body, that she was, again, kind of a sultry, temptation for male spectators. And so that tainted the image of women's sports by doing something that male athletes do very often in the sporting space. And so when we also consider money, women athletes get paid significantly less than male athletes. And also notably, white athletes get paid more than black athletes, illuminating both sexist and racist opinions towards women in sports. And so I bring that up because one of the ways in which a lot of women athletes were able to get money was to capitalize on their sexiness and their objectifying gaze. That a lot of athletes felt like they had no choice, that either they were going to go broke as professional athletes, or they could capitalize on this objectifying gaze, make some money off of it, while promoting the sport agenda, the idea that sports should be for everyone and by everyone. And so we see that very vividly in our documentary this week, Not Just a Game, which briefly discusses the history of women in sports as well as perceptions of gender, consumption, and sexuality. So please give this a watch this week. Take note of the answers to the following questions. What was the first women's sports that shook the sporting world and masculine ideals to its core? What were other women's sports that challenged the sanctity of men's sports? Who are the predominant names you heard in the documentary and why? And then how has objectification of women athletes changed sports? And so I bring all this up to say that, again, you're probably going to be exposed to a culture of women's sports that is very outdated. I mean, obviously this is a history of sports class, but I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that this history, this treatment is not so far removed from the current day, that mere decades have existed between the treatment of women athletes in the early 2000s to now. And so I think that that's also very marked by the idea that there are a lot of sporting crises that were happening during this era. And so I want this to also serve as a trigger warning to folks who may be particularly sensitive to things that we are going to be talking about. So things like bribery, body abuse, sexual abuse, violence that happens within the sporting space, that these things did happen. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why in particular this era is marked by these behaviors and how we see these behaviors kind of shift in different forms today. So we find that this is an era of rampant bribery. We find this with the Olympics, with the 2002 Winter Games in Salt Lake City, Utah, which this is an era, or this was an example in which the International Olympics Bid Committee was actually bribed with gifts, cash, acceptance for their kids to go to American universities, because these bids to host the Olympics became a lot more competitive. And the reason why the bids became so much more competitive is because after the 1984 LA Olympics, we were able to turn a profit. And so people started to recognize that there's actually money to be had if you're able to do it in a way that's very smart, very competitive, very commercialized. And so with that, these bids to host the Olympics became extremely competitive. And so they were able to basically bribe the IOC in order to host, because Salt Lake City wanted to make some money off of hosting the Olympics. But this scandal created global distrust for the IOC and created a lot more rules for cities to be able to send their bids in, as well as acknowledging that there wasn't going to be any illicit activity with these bids. The NBA, which very interestingly, we actually have a lot of issues with the NBA with insider leaks anyway right now. But anyway, during this era, we had a lot of referee collusion, particularly with Tim Donaghy in 2007, in which he was bribed to prolong the playoffs. He got caught cheating, or, so it's not just Tim, but it's a bunch of other refs as well, but he was kind of the face and the name of this incidents that happened in the NBA. But they were bribed to prolong playoffs. They got caught betting on the games that they were officiating. They gave information to gambling mobsters and started to make a lot of interesting favorable calls during certain games. So bribery was really rampant during this time, which caused a lot of distrust for people who, again, kind of thought of a sport as a space of integrity and honesty. Those foundations were starting to be shook. We also have an era of doping. And so baseball in particular, this was the steroid era. This was really came to light due to an initiative by a senator really kind of wanting to expose that doping, particularly from performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, had been rampant within professional baseball for many generations. And so this really came to the forefront of our understanding of baseball. Athletes like Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds were kind of the name and the face of this movement. But like I said, this was an investigation from Commissioner Bug Selig, as well as former U.S. Senator George Mitchell, that showed over 100 players tested positive for steroids in professional baseball. And this was really impactful because, again, if we're going to say that sport is a fair and honest space, but then at the highest level have these athletes cheat their way to notoriety, to records, that really didn't allow for a lot of growth and favorable looks at the sport. And so, unfortunately, this really impacted both Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds in that quest for notoriety, because just these past few years, in which it was their last time that they were able to be enacted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, they weren't. And so people, even today, decades later, still feel a certain type of way about these athletes cheating and using performance-enhancing drugs in order to become legends in the sport. We also have other instances of doping as well, particularly with the sport of cycling. In contrast to what we saw with baseball, they were able to kind of have performance enhancements in other ways. A lot of athletes would actually exercise blood doping, which is kind of exactly what it sounds. They would inject themselves with red blood cells, which for the science folks, red blood cells basically carry oxygen to our muscles. So if you have an increased oxidative environment, you're able to metabolize more oxygen. You're able to prolong your performance in sport, and so that was really helpful in a cardiovascular sport like cycling. We also have a lot of folks who were using testosterone, like Floyd Landis. Again, testosterone, a hormone that everybody has, but more so than the normal or expected level. And we also have athletes like Lance Armstrong who used PEDs. They were stripped of their accolades and kind of marred for their behaviors to kind of break down the foundation, the morality aspect of sports. For violence in sport, football really continued to be in the eye of scrutiny with a lot of violence, both on the field and off during this era. Just to give you some examples, we have Michael Vick, who was convicted or, condemned of animal violence. He was the quarterback for the Falcons. He was indicted for animal cruelty for illegal dogfights. We also had Bountygate during this era. That was assault from 2009 to 2011, where head coach of the New Orleans Saints, Sean Payton, would pay bounties on opposing players to get hurt. He was banned for a year, and players' game suspension ran from 1 game to a full year, depending on how severe that bounty execution was. We also have Ray Rice for assault. He was a running back for the Ravens. He only suffered a 2-game suspension after getting caught on camera knocking his girlfriend out in an elevator and dragging her out. We also have Adrian Peterson, who's a running back for a lot of different teams, but namely for the Titans. Towards the end of his career, he was suspended for hitting his 4-year-old son with a switch or a tree branch. He was actually, I think, just caught with driving under the influence very recently. We also have Aaron Hernandez, which kind of infamously marked for murder-suicide. He was a tight end for the New England Patriots. He was indicted for double murder charges in 2014. He murdered his best friend and his best friend's partner. So while he was in prison, he actually killed himself. And Hernandez was actually posthumously diagnosed with severe chronic traumatic encephalopathy, neuropathy, which is CTE, as most of us kind of are familiar with. This is a very severe neurodegenerative disease associated with violence, depression, and dementia-like symptoms. And he, at the time, was 27 years old, suffered the most severe CTE of any person found his age. And so how it kind of works is very similar to other neurodegenerative diseases, in which these plaques accumulate in your brain, and those plaques kind of eat away at different tissues in your brain. And so because of these plaques, you start to see that there's less white matter, there's less gray matter. And so with that, you start to see ventricular enlargements, basically just like there's less brain tissue for things to happen. And in particular, CTE impacts the prefrontal cortex, which is how we regulate emotions, how we have decision making. And so unfortunately, for a lot of folks in football and other violent sports in which traumatic brain injuries are very common, we see that this is very much impacted and visible by very irrational behavior, very quick to anger, making a lot of maybe unsavory choices, violent execution. And so we saw that very vividly with Aaron Hernandez. We also see that this is an era still marred by homophobia and gender issues. The general acceptance surrounding the LGBTQIA community has grown in and out of sport. We've had many athletes like Jason Collins, Brittany Griner, and Michael Sam who have allowed their sexuality to be part of a general conversation around athletics and sexuality, particularly with queer athletes. We also have the gay games, which happen every 4 years, like the Olympics, and allow anyone to play, but really with the intent to celebrate queer athletics, and when we see that in the sporting space. However, there's still an issue of gender that's very pervasive, particularly because as it exists now, sport really only exists in the gender binary, in which there's women's sports and there's men's sports. And if you don't fit into those two categories, then you don't really have a place in sport. And so this is particularly impactful for athletes like Caster Semenya, who is an intersex athlete. She's a gold medalist in the 800 meter sprint, but after a decade-long battle with international sporting competitions, has been banned from any and all sport organizations and competitions until she takes hormone regulators to bring her naturally occurring testosterone levels down to normal woman levels, basically ignoring the plights of intersex athletes that have biological predispositions to allow them to be better athletes, even though that's how their body naturally happens. We also have another issue in terms of transgender athletes. And so Caitlyn Jenner transitioned in 2015, was a very, very dominant, very highly prolific athlete in the 1980s in the decathlon, but really forced a lot of people to come to terms with their internalized transphobia, that this idea of a very dominant, very masculine athlete transitioning later in life really forced people to have to think about this as a way of beyond sport. Like people, athletes or otherwise, have a duty to live their best and truest life. And how does sport fit into that is really kind of a greater conversation now, especially when access is very much politicized by current political administrations as well as cultural values of the time. This was also a time that unfortunately we saw an uptick in sexual predators utilizing sport as a medium to gain access to victims. That sexual assault and misconduct led to discussions over power dynamics and abuse led by coaches and staff members within the sporting space. And just to give you some examples for professional hockey, we had the Maple Leaf Gardens case in which the equipment manager Gordon Stuckless and youth coach Graham James were indicted for molesting young children. We have the NC2A Penn State case where the assistant football coach Jerry Sandusky molested young boys under the veil of his charity to help underprivileged children. He, the head coach, the athletic director, and the university president were either fired or resigned, and the school was punished by multi-million-dollar fines, stripped of their football titles, and banned from playoff contention for 4 years. The NFL, we have examples like Ben Roethlisberger and Adrian Peterson, who Big Ben, as a lot of people kind of think of him as, was the quarterback for the Steelers. He was accused of rape in 2008 and sexual assault in 2010. He only suffered a 4-game suspension. There are also many other instances of promiscuity and fathering children from multiple women, in which AP has 6 kids from 6 different women. And then finally getting at the idea of racism, which again, as we've seen in this class, racism in sport isn't new, but it's taken much more nuanced positions and nuanced representations. And so Historically, as we've seen, sports leaders have been predominantly white. People in leadership positions are usually white, upper class, waspy men. And so in order to combat this, the NFL instated what's called the Rooney Rule, based off of, a Coach Rooney in 2003. This states that a minority person, someone from a minority background, must be interviewed if there is a head coaching position available. Now that has shifted that since I believe it's 2016 that you have to interview 2 people of a minority background. And minority background doesn't necessarily have to just mean race. It can also mean gender. So you can interview folks of color, but also women for these head coaching positions. And so in 2024, that was a record-breaking year in which 9 out of 32 head coaches of color were coaching head coaches in the NFL. 2025, now that is down 7 out of 32. But I want us to be very mindful of this representation too, that we've seen greater representation in this, right? Since Art Shell being the very first Black coach of the modern NFL, we've seen it steadily grow, in which we have that increased representation. But compared to white coaches, it is still very much a small percentage. Additionally, when you consider that 76% of the athletes that make up the NFL are athletes of color, we don't have that representation in leadership. And so even though this is a form of affirmative action to combat historical racism, I want us to be mindful and reflective of if this is even working, if we are actually truly providing equity in leadership positions in sport. Because again, it's not to say that they have to hire folks of color, but they just have to interview them. And oftentimes people who are very critical of the Rooney Rule acknowledge that for a lot of general managers and owners, they already know who they're going to hire before they even start the interview process. And so it's kind of just like a box to check, something that you have to do in order to hire someone else without really taking it for what it is, which is providing equitable opportunity for people to get these chances. And so, as we've seen, people in leadership pretty much generally find themselves giving other leadership positions to people like them, whether by race, socioeconomics, background. And so unfortunately, even though this is a form of affirmative action, it's really a time to tell to see if this will really impact people in the leadership space. But with that, to kind of get into our changes in sport, acknowledging that, again, of all of these different traumatic issues that have happened in sport during the turn of the 21st century, there are a lot of changes that have happened as a result, positive changes, in which TBI, as we talked about, really kind of spurred a grander conversation after the 2013 lawsuit, in which over 500 former NFL players sued the league for not properly protecting them from traumatic brain injury and CTE. They eventually got a $765 million buyout or settlement that would either go towards the foundations of athletes that have passed away or as reparations for currently alive athletes. And so because of this, people started to pay attention to these sports that might encourage traumatic brain injury, especially at a very young age. And so a lot of youth sport organizations started to change the rules of their sports in order to minimize head collisions, because youth athletes are a lot more susceptible to life-altering issues as a result of traumatic brain injury at a young age. United States Soccer started to ban headers for kids under the age of 10. Pop Warner also eliminated the kickoff, which is actually when most traumatic brain injuries and other injuries happen, was during kickoffs. We also see this rule reflected in professional football as well. We also see a greater acceptance of alternative sports that we talked about last week, the idea that culture made it popular, but commercialization made it very profitable. Rebel culture was extremely strong during this era. Again, people kind of rejected these long-standing traditional elements of sports, so they liked the idea of alternative games being very different. However, commercialization made it still very profitable and also made it mainstream. Stars that really shaped this mainstream acceptance are Tony Hawk, right, for folks who played Tony Hawk Ultimate Skateboarder, but he is also very much bringing skateboarding into the common mainstream light. We also have Kelly Slater, who's pictured here, for surfing. We also have Shaun White for snowboarding. Again, just kind of these names that we have, the household names now, that were really representatives of this new wave of sport. And so as we reflect on this end of our chapter, end of our textbook, I want us to be mindful of this question of, is sport really for everyone? And in this modern era, acknowledging that sport is being offered to any and everyone who really takes advantage of it. There's year-round youth sports, there's school leagues, there's community programs, masters leagues for older adults, and it really gives chances of people of all ages and populations to play. However, we really don't see that happening. Very few people, especially older adults outside of the youth sports space, really engage in sport or physical activity regularly, which unfortunately could be a contributing factor to our nation's high level of obesity, heart rate, diabetes, and other hypokinetic diseases. We do find that as a result of this inactivity, this general cultural inclination of inactivity, that some activities have grown in popularity. Aerobic and strength-based fitness organizations like CrossFit, jogging, running, swimming, cycling, and triathlon all gained popularity during this era as well. Very similarly, we've seen that these sports or these organizations have both a community and a competitive aspect. So even if you're not necessarily doing it to be the best CrossFitter in the nation, you can also find a sense of community, which helps people feel more connected to an activity if they feel like they're accepted in that space. And so as we reflect on, again, the end of our textbook, I think it's interesting to acknowledge where they thought the future of sport was going to grow. And one of the things that I think is very true is that they thought that UFC and MMA was going to grow. That boxing generally has been replaced by Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, and mixed martial arts, MMA. They combine various forms of boxing, wrestling, and jiu-jitsu, but it's never going to be truly accepted into the mainstream sporting space. And I think that it's really due to the fact that this sport exists primarily to be violent, and very much is reserved by folks who are very devoted to the sport via pay-per-view gatekeeping strategies. And so it is really only for folks who are devoted enough to pay for that to really be the ones to enjoy it. But they recognize that this is a sport that does have a lot of opportunity for gender equality. Ronda Rousey being one of the most prolific names during this era, really allowing UFC and MMA to be a gendered equal space. So much so that Dana White very much loves having women athletes kind of start or even end these major bout competitions. We also acknowledge that soccer is probably anticipated to grow, along with sports sciences really devoted to changing the sport to make it more high-tech, make it more exciting. We also have to acknowledge that at the time, they thought virtual sport was going to be the kind of fix to this hypokinetic, very sedentary kind of culture that we find ourselves being in. That they acknowledge that movement-based video games like the Nintendo Wii at the time, which now the Switch exists for similar purposes. We also have Oculus VR, to kind of be a part of this like very metaphysical space for video game interactions. But they even acknowledge that fantasy sports teams can be a way to get people involved in the sporting space. It creates increased spectatorship as well as gambling initiatives, and then esports as well, that even if they're not movement-based video games, esports, playing traditional, console to controller video games, allows people to become fans of sports and can actually encourage people to participate in those traditional sports. There's a lot of international competition, there's massive payouts, and people have a greater understanding and appreciation of sport by playing these sports video games. And so they also acknowledge too that sport will continue to hold political power, serve as a reminder of our past, but also as a medium to evolve for our future. So again, that's kind of the wrap up of the chapter, and the wrap up is really kind of focusing on 2015. So remember the effects of 9/11 on nationalism in sport. Understand the differences in growth, spectatorship, and money for the MLB, NFL, NBA, NHL, boxing, tennis, golf, soccer, and auto racing, and what some of the reasons why those sports in particular grew into the businesses that they are today. For women in sport, kind of understand the myths of Title IX from Edson Chapter 27 and how they're debunked, and acknowledge the media portrayals of women in the early 2000s as either sexy or as mothers. Understand the various sporting crises of the era, like bribery, doping, violence, homophobia, infamous cases of sexual predation, as well as racism, and how we see that with the Rooney Rule, if it's effective or not. In terms of changes in sport, recognize traumatic brain injury lawsuit and rule changes as a result of those TBI initiatives. alternative sport acceptance and commercialization, and then time. This is a time in which we have the most opportunity to play, but we don't see that, and then some of the reasons why. We just covered the future of sport. So all this to say, again, this is the wrap up of our text. Next week, we are going to be going over everything that's happened since then. So between 2015 and 2025, various instances in how sport has grown and some of the things that I think are the most impactful for the culture and historical reflection of sport today. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you then. Bye.